Discussion time. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another discussion video because there is a big question circling the 40k community right now. So I'm going to sit down, play some sweet Warhammer 40k Space Marines, and we'll talk about it. Over the last few weeks, a few high-profile games of 40k have ended contentiously. These have been the finals and semifinals of major-sized events, although the actual size categories of 40k events are kind of up in the air. It's basically events with over 100 players. And the reason for the contention wasn't some ephemeral, ungraspable concept like rules disputes or sportsmanship. It was actually one of the fundamental dimensions of human existence, and that is time. In particular, the events in question mandated the use of chess clocks to keep track of players' time usage throughout the game. For those who don't know, a chess clock is a staple in competitive tabletop games like chess, hence the name a chess clock, just makes a lot of sense, and a lot of miniatures games. It's composed of a linked system of two timers, both set to count down the same total amount of time, but with the caveat that as long as one clock is running, the other is paused. This allows the total time in a round, for 40k usually about 2.5 to maybe 3 hours, to be split in half, and half of that time to be allocated equally to each player, giving them the same amount of time to execute all of their game actions over the course of the game as the other person. Once one player's time runs out, they typically will suffer some sort of penalties, such as not being able to complete voluntary actions like moving your models around, and sometimes even automatically failing all their rolls, including saving throws and morale. It just depends on the event in question. Now that sounds like a pretty harsh penalty, but before we dive any deeper into this discussion, I do want to offer up the caveat that only about maybe 5% of timed games of 40k, which is a number that I definitely just made up, is the chess clock even in consideration. The vast majority of competitive 9th edition games are completed within about 2 hours of actual gameplay with a little bit of setup beforehand, and timing is rarely an obstacle, meaning that both players have ample time remaining on their chess clocks in the instances where chess clocks are used. So if they don't really matter, why are we even talking about these little clockwork gadgets? Well, it's that pesky 5% of games, how contentious the timing can be when there's a penalty to it, and whether, in the light of that contention, the open question, should 40k even use chess clocks at all? So to begin with, for a moment, let's take ourselves back to a happier time before arcane techno-wizardry had created a time-telling device capable of fairly recording time expenditure between two opponents of a children's board game. Or at least before we used that same device widely in our games of Warhammer 40,000s. So basically, like until last year. As much as I think we all wish we had infinite time on our hands and could live always and forever as some sort of immortal gods, unfortunately, games of 40k in an organized setting have to have a time limit, so rounds can progress and the event can finish before everyone is unceremoniously booted out of the event venue. This has the potential to mean that some games might not finish by the end of their round timer, and therefore requires some form of adjudication to determine the actual result. Normally, the game is scored as is and counts the current battle round as the end of the game, rather than battle round 5 as would normally happen in a Grand Tournament 9th edition game. Normally, that would seem fine. That is, until you consider a situation where a player would be winning on the game state as it stands, but would run the risk of losing were that game to be played to its logical conclusion. As always with any sort of game mechanics, including meta-mechanical concepts like time usage and pairing systems, the game ability, or the ability of players to leverage that feature to gain an advantage over other players in the event, should be considered. Now, this is an important concept because I'm going to be coming back to it later, so put a pin right in that. And this example, where one player winning in the current game state but potentially losing in the future game state, and as a result playing to the end of time rather than the natural conclusion of the end of the game, and therefore winning in a situation where they would normally lose, is the game ability of this system that doesn't really have concrete timing mechanics built in. And I think we can all agree that that's not the desired outcome for a competitive game, regardless of the game, Warhammer 40,000 included. Now, we can discuss whether or not this kind of play is sportsmanlike, and we can create rules in event packets trying to curb it, but there is infinite gray area and it requires a ton of arbitration. After all, how do you distinguish between intentional slow playing and someone just taking a while to consider a very important move or measure their moves out very precisely? It can get super tricky. But a chess clock doesn't leave any room for gray area. Either you have the time to perform your actions or you don't, full stop, end of story, that's it, everybody can go home. So rather than fall back on judge calls, vague rules, and sportsmanship to curb the abuse of a tournament's timing format, we instead have an elegant, concrete solution sitting right there in front of us. Now, are there downsides to using chess clocks? Of course there are. The hardware itself needs to actually be provided to players for use, and for a tournament running typically on razor-thin margins, trying to supply and power them for 100+ tables in these larger events, it can be difficult and expensive. Not to mention that, there's also a learning curve. Players have to get used to using a chess clock and flipping the timer to their opponent when their opponent is taking game actions, and sometimes complex chess clocks can steepen that curve even more. But with more and more players introducing chess clocks to their regular practice games to save time, and also bringing them to tournaments to use themselves, these hurdles are quickly being overcome. After all, if you're going to a tournament, you already need dice, a tape measure, measuring sticks, data sheets, books. Adding a chess clock on top of that wouldn't be the end of the world if they wish to use it. Not to mention that, regardless of who's actually purchasing the chess clock, it's a small price to pay to remove the abuse I covered earlier from the game entirely. So it seems pretty straightforward. Why would there be contention over this issue? In the two recent cases I mentioned previously that are stirring up this controversy, the chess clock was not tracked properly, with players allegedly forgetting to pass the time to one another, asking or answering questions on their opponent's time. And in both cases, one player by the end of the game had run out of time, which raised some hackles, things got a little heated, and plastered a big asterisk on the final results of those games in question. So this seems like a similar abuse to the situation I mentioned earlier, with a player slow playing to get the result they want. Right? No. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. And I'm going to drop a monumental hot take here, so get ready to start an irate Reddit thread and slag me off in the comment section of this video. In fact, if you could engage with this video as much as possible, that would be absolutely wonderful and help the channel immensely. Whereas a player being slow played against in a non-chess clock timed game has no mechanical recourse against their opponent. After all, they can ask their opponent to speed up their gameplay, or maybe they can take their case to a judge for an indeterminate result that also will still use up time. There's nothing they can do immediately on their opponent's turn to make them take less time. On the other hand, if a player on a chess clock runs out of time, it is ultimately entirely their own fault. This is because chess clocks place the control of time usage directly under the control of both of those players, not just the one who's currently acting. If you're worried about timing out, you can be more vigilant about switching time for opposed roles or your opponent's questions. After all, anytime your opponent is doing things or getting questions answered, their own clock should be ticking down. Especially in an age where we have the Warhammer app and Wahapedia to quickly look up rules, there should be no recourse to weaponize the chess clock to answer rules questions. They can also take game actions faster and execute plans that will resolve more quickly. In fact, I have a whole video about optimizing your chess clock usage that is available for patrons and channel members. You can join in the link down below the video or on patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Shameless plug for Advanced Tactics, our video series where we deep dive into tactical concepts in 40k. It's a real good time. You should check it out. So while a player can try to weaponize the clock to make their opponent time out, whether or not that timeout actually occurs is entirely up to the skill level of the opponent in question. You know, like how a game works. And that brings me back to the point I mentioned earlier about the gameability of mechanics, and where I think the heart of this discussion, and actually many other recent controversies in the 40k community stem from. And that is, in the face of mechanical problems like the slow play issue I mentioned earlier, a downright refusal to accept any metamechanical features of a competitive event should be gamified. And then, with that taken into account, designed to prevent them being abused in the way that the community already dislikes. Like, for example, being slow played. There is a desire in the 40k community to separate each individual game of Warhammer 40,000 within an event from the framing device, for lack of a better term, of the tournament as a whole, and vilify players that use any mechanics outside those of the Warhammer 40,000 core rules to their benefit, those being things like game timers, pairing metrics, or final placement scores. But ultimately, players of all calibers will look for an advantage to get ahead in a competitive context. In any level of game design, this is taken as a core tenet. And anyone who has watched a tactical video to improve their gameplay at their local league or asked advice in a forum on how to defeat their best friend's particular army is guilty of this. And here's the thing, those aren't bad things. Using metagame features like information, matchup knowledge, and the meta mechanics of a tournament aren't bad things. In fact, Warhammer 40,000 is the only competitive environment I've encountered that has this attitude. If you look at almost any other competitive game, from Magic the Gathering to basketball, you'll find things like intentional draws and clock runouts are not only accepted, but common tactics that players and teams are encouraged to employ to improve their results. So rather than try our hardest to remove these abuses from the game by trying to strong-arm players with decidedly mixed results, I think we as a community need to shift our focus to embracing them more. Ultimately, chess clock timing isn't some bizarre weapon that players can level against their opponent to try to bleed them out of precious time. But instead, it's a resource like models or command points that are distributed fairly at the beginning of the game and can be utilized over the course of the game. And similar to how careless positioning of your models can lose you those assets and the use of them later on as they're removed by enemy fire, careless use of a chess clock can lose you those precious seconds. And an appropriate chess clock discipline can then enter the competitive sphere as an additional and legitimate expression of player skill in a competitive format. Now, am I saying that players should be trying to make their opponent forget to flip their chess clock? No, obviously not. And ultimately, that's basically the same as a player forgetting to use a stratagem or tick up their CP at the start of the turn. Ultimately, the game should still be fun and fair for both players, and sportsmanship is always going to be a large part of it. But a chess clock also entirely removes one avenue that unsportsmanlike players can use to gain an unfair advantage, that being through their slow play. But with that in mind, players who diligently flip their clock to their opponents while they're rolling dice and making decisions should not be vilified as some sort of pariah if their opponent is forgetful enough to not flip it back. Ultimately, control over your side of the chess clock is your responsibility, and it's up to that player to make sure that they're not ticking down when they don't need to be. As long as, of course, their opponent's not a total dick about it. So at the end of the day, to answer the question, should 40k use chess clocks? The answer is obviously yes, and probably more than we already do. Now, before I wrap things up, I do want to address 3 major comments that I definitely expect to receive on this video.
I've never had a problem finishing my game, so why does timekeeping even matter?
Well, it's nice anecdotally that a person may be able to play fast and under the round limit, and I find that's the same for me as well. While I am a huge proponent of chess clocks, and especially in competitive tabletop simulator games, I always use a chess clock. I very rarely find that I need one in in-person games. But other people have had trouble finishing their games, and you still could too, since without a chess clock, like we talked about before, there is no recourse if your opponent wants to slow play you out. And that is why we're having this discussion. Chess clocks are ultimately there to prevent the weaponization of time as a way to gain an advantage over the other player, since an untimed game is one that is easily manipulated by an unscrupulous operator.
But forcing armies with lots of models or different phase activations onto a timer can limit their power.
Now, in my opinion, this is a good point, and probably the only legitimate criticism of chess clocks in tabletop games outside the downsides I mentioned earlier in the video. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, this is a necessary evil. And in this situation, you should also consider that armies that take a lot of time to operate by moving multiple times per turn or just having a lot of models or attacks to resolve can similarly gain an unfair advantage in untimed formats by taking time away from the other player and being easier to slow play, whether or not it's intentional or unintentional. Chess clocks simply make operating such armies require additional skill, which I don't think is the worst thing in the world.
Trevi, you're a sexual tyrannosaurus, and I can't keep my eyes off your beautiful, perfectly crafted videos.
Well, thank you, dear commenter, for subscribing. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your continued patronage. And with that, we'll close out the video. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end. Big thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. YouTube channel members, also Twitch subscribers. All those people are great, and I love them. And I hope to see you on a timed battlefield sometime soon. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.